Among the smaller mountains of New England are a few which, through a fortunate combination of characteristics and circumstances, merit more than passing consideration. They are the mountains which, in the course of years, have become not more widely known, but rather better known and liked in the small circle of their acquaintance. They are the hills that have achieved recognition not so much by reason of great height, difficult access, or majestic appearance, but more because they have attractive contours, splendid views, distinctive location, interesting history, or perhaps merely an individual and pleasing personality. One of these mountains is Ascutney in Vermont. Like many another small mountain, Ascutney is a focal point of the surrounding country, and not only the physical history of the region, but the social history as well, has been associated with and influenced by the mountain.
Hello, I'm Barbara Rhoad, along with some other directors of the Ascutney Trails Association, and we're here to talk about Mount Ascutney. Before we get onto the association, maybe just a little bit about our love for Mount Ascutney. It certainly is like a beacon to many of us. If you're coming up Route 91 and you see Mount Ascutney, or if you swing around from 89 to 91, there's Mount Ascutney, and it welcomes you home. And I'm sure in the 1760s, when Timothy Lull and Steele Smith, who came and settled Windsor and Hartland, as they paddled up the Connecticut, I am sure that they looked at Mount Ascutney. And Don, probably some of your relatives looked at Mount Ascutney as they came to settle Springfield. Mount Ascutney is basically in the towns of Wethersfield, Windsor, and West Windsor. And it has probably one of the oldest hiking trails. Some people say it is the oldest hiking trail, because back in 1825, when Lafayette came to visit the United States, one of the facts that we hear a lot is that they were going to build a road up Mount Ascutney so he could look at the upper valley. Lafayette never quite made it, but eventually there was a trail, and I think the first trail was surveyed maybe in the 1850s. And before we start on this, I'd like to just read a little bit of a poem that Calvin Coolidge recited to people when he came here in 1927 after the Great Flood. It said, "Vermont is a state I love. I could not look upon the peaks of Ascutney, Killington, or Mansfield without being moved in a way that no other scene could move me." And I think Ascutney means a lot to people. So today we're going to talk about the oldest trail, the Windsor Trail. I think it was in 1857 when the first Windsor Trail was surveyed. Then a Ascutney Mountain Club, was it?
AMA, Ascutney Mountain Association.
Was formed in 1903. And there's a stone hut that was built in the late 1800s and reconstructed in 1903. Well, right now I'm going to introduce some of the other people sitting at this table. Crofter Cummings. Is that going? Oh, Crofter Cummings, who is a member of the Ascutney Trails Association, who grew up in Windsor, who has a lot of wonderful stories about Mount Ascutney as a young man hiking up there with his friends that we'll talk about later. Next to me is Ralph Bissell, who also grew up in Windsor and hiked Mount Ascutney when he was a young man. He's still a young man at 95, but he'll tell you some stories about, a lot of interesting stories about Mount Ascutney and the Windsor Trail. He also was one of the charter members of the Ascutney Trails Association, and that was formed in 1966 by Herb Ogden of Hartland, Vermont. And Ralph will also probably tell you a few things about that organization. And then to my right is Don Whitney in Springfield, Vermont. He's a longtime director of the Ascutney Trails Association and has hiked the mountain a lot. So, Ralph, maybe we'll begin with you, some of your memories.
Well, the Ascutney Trails organization was first thought of, I guess, by Herb Ogden. And at the time, John Howland and Bob Ely were trying to put a ski trails up there, and Bob Ely did a lot of hiking around the north slopes of Mount Ascutney. So Herb got hold of Bob Ely, and they talked it over and decided that they would try to get a association and fix up the trails. And Bob Ely knew that I had been around the mountain a few times, so he suggested that I join them. And then Dean Milligan was quite a hiker and runner around town, and he was invited to join. And I suggested we get Gussie Aldrich from Springfield. Gussie was considerably older than I was, but in my lifetime I have never met a more knowledgeable outdoor man than Gussie Aldrich. And he certainly gave us a lot of information on the outdoors and how things are and how things should be. And he was a great man, and he now is a part of his love at Mount Katahdin, somewhere on Mount Katahdin.
Hey, Ralph, can you just tell us a little bit about when you were younger and going up the Windsor Trail, camping out? And I love the story about the fire ranger.
Well, I was always sort of I'd rather be hiking around the woods than I had fooling around the town. And I used to go up the mountain. The first few times I went up with adults, but then I got knowing they had a fire ranger up that time, and they always claimed that originally he was a Texas Ranger. Now, I cannot verify, but I know he was a heck of a nice guy. But I don't know how. My father was a very conservative person, and how he ever let me go as a kid and stay weeks at a time up there on the mountain with a forest ranger. I now wonder, but I didn't at the time.
Maybe he wanted to get rid of you for the summer, Rob.
I don't know, but he asked me if I wanted to stay a week up in his cabin with him, and I did. And the first time we came down, I brought my bedroll back, and thinking that was it. But between the ranger and I, we persuaded that I could go back up for another week. And it was very interesting. At that time, there was a telephone up there that was far from being reliable. And every time a wind blew very much, a limb would break the wire. And that meant hiking down from the ranger's cabin down to find the break. And whoever put that wire in originally chose the most difficult walking area in the whole mountain. I know they did. But during times of dry weather in the summertime, the ranger was supposed to go up at least 3 times a day. And if it was real dry, he'd sometimes stay up there for an extended period of time. But the tower at that time was wooden, and you got up there was just a ladder, a type of steps. You just climb up the ladder until you got to the platform. And many of the time I used to climb up with him and sit there on a platform and just look around the state for smoke. And if we saw it, then we'd call Windsor and give them a compass reading on it, and they could investigate it more locally.
I don't know the whole history of all the fire towers, but I think there was a whole series of them on other mountains.
Yeah.
Probably Okemo
Oh,
maybe
yes.
had one,
Yes.
and
Yeah,
Killington.
Yeah.
Yeah, most of the mountains, 3,000 feet or more, had towers, and they were manned.
Right, because I think recently there's been a book written about the old fire towers on other mountains. Now, where did you stay when you were up there? Did he have a cabin?
Oh yes, they had a ranger's cabin. It's just below the top.
Yeah.
And you climb up a trail, sort of up a ledge, and over probably 200-300 yards to the stone.
Is that
Cabin.
It's kind of a flat area there.
Yes.
Yeah.
was that off the
The
slide?
last time I was there, you could see the base logs, or the remains of them still at the side of it.
Yeah.
Don, is that where the slot and slab trail come, or Crofter? Is that where they come together? Is that where it is?
That's where the ranger cabin site is now. We have a sign there now. It says ranger cabin site.
Right, so that's where. Hey, we'll give you a rest, Ralph, a minute. Crofter, do you want to tell us about your adventures as a young man hiking up that mountain?
Yeah, I don't think they're quite as exciting as Ralph's, but
Oh.
I'll do my best. My hiking days started more like 1933 when I became a scout, and Bob Maxim was our Boy Scout master. And we used to do a lot of hiking and camping, but I don't think I actually went up the mountain all the way to probably 1935. And even then, we didn't go to the summit where your wooden tower was. When we went up the Windsor Trail, of course the trail at that time pretty much followed the brook, pretty much straight up, and more or less along where the C&C campsite, C&C logging road was. I think the trail more or less followed the logging road all the way to Halfway Spring. And then the trail then was the 1903 trail. We'd go left when we got to the Halfway Spring. And then when we got to Castle Rock, the trail then was the same as the trail now when you go from Castle Rock down to the slot. That was the trail. Then you'd turn right on the slot trail till you got to the cabin site. And what we always were interested in was going to Brownsville Rock. That seemed to be our destination. I don't think we paid much attention to the actual summit.
Probably you thought that was the summit, right?
Probably, and I don't remember ever seeing that wooden tower, and it was there then. But anyway, what we did was we would stay at cabin for the ranger, which was in very bad shape by the time we got there. The porcupines had come in and chewed on it, and even at night when we were sleeping, the porkies would come in and join us, and we'd all run out in the middle of the night. And when we wanted to go to Brownsville Rock, all we had to do was to climb up over the rocks by the ranger cabin, and there was Brownsville Rock, and where the cabin, where the stone shelter is.
What was where the stone hut was? Was it all broken down at that time? Just a pile of
it was broken down then too, yeah. Because I don't think we even paid much attention to the site. We were interested in getting to Brownsville Rock. And the other interesting thing about Brownsville Rock was the lemon squeezer. You remember that, don't you, Ralph?
Yeah.
And that's where we could get some water then too.
Yes.
We could.
There was a spring there.
Yeah, you've been down there, haven't you?
Yes, I have.
But when you get to Brownsville Rock, you went to the left and went down along the side and then down through it. And wherever the lemon squeezer was, there was also water you could get to drink.
Oh, I didn't realize that. Is there water there now?
I don't think so.
I bet
That's
there
where
is
we
right
got our
now.
water when I
Right
lived
now.
up there. Stayed there.
It is.
Yes.
Was it
We
running?
got our water there all the time. I stayed at the ranger's cabin.
Was it running pretty good for you, or did you have to wait for drips?
No, it was a small stream.
Oh, that's better than what I saw. I only remember drips and drops. You had to really be patient.
It was nice water.
Yeah.
Crofter, you mentioned you went up with the Boy Scouts, and something I read recently, they said, was there a camp, a Boy Scout hut, or something called Sumiko or Sumiko or something?
I have heard, I've never seen it, but somebody told me that it used to be halfway between Castle Rock and the slab. After you start down that steep portion to get to the slab, that there used to be a Boy Scout camp there, but I never saw
And you
it.
don't remember that name?
No.
I read that in some information about the mountain that I don't
And I don't know
recall.
when that would have been either.
Right.
There's
You
a-
were speaking of a porcupine. Yesterday, I went up the Weathersfield Trail to check it out, and I was on Gus's lookout all by myself, and a porcupine just came walking right out,
Really?
went right by into the
Wow.
woods. Now, where did you bring your tents up to camp in, or
Oh.
just under the stars, huh?
Well, what we did quite a bit was on a Friday night, we would walk out to the mountain.
You
and we
walk
would-
all the way from Windsor
from Windsor.
to the mountain?
Well,
Wow.
yeah, it's a couple of miles, right?
Uh-huh.
And then we would go up to Jerry Falls or Gary Falls. Anyway, we would go up to Gary Falls and we would sleep there. And then the next day, we'd just leave our stuff, and the next day we'd go up to the top and spend the day and come back down again. That's what we did a lot. And because that seemed to work pretty good. And then, of course, if we wanted to go start and go up on the same day, that would be different. But this seemed to be a ritual we did. Was Friday night, we'd go out there, camp down below, and then go up the next day and spend the day up there.
That's interesting. You say that you walked out from Windsor, because I think back when they had the Ascutney Mountain Club, that was an accepted and only way that you got out there. And I often heard that they would build a big bonfire on top of the mountain at that time, so the people back in Windsor knew they had arrived. I'd love to know if that's true.
Yeah,
You ever hear that, Ralph?
Yeah, you would know about that, Ralph.
Well, when I was in the seventh and eighth grade, the principal was quite an outdoors and also a scout leader, and a couple of the women teachers, and they'd take 35 kids that wanted to go up the mountain overnight, and we'd
Walk out?
Yep, and we'd build a big fire and have our supper, and then we'd all sit around this fire, and then they'd start telling ghost stories and such, and we managed to get most of the girls so darn scared they didn't want to go to bed, and they'd all sit right around their campfire or lie around there with their feet up gathering to eat and spend the night up there. I'd say that, I think, with a big group like that twice.
No,
It
that's
was
wonderful.
quite a lot of fun.
I bet it was. Hey, Don, can you tell us anything about the history of the Ascutney Mountain Club that started?
Well, I can tell you a little bit because I brought a little cue card with me. They started in 1903. They started the Ascutney Mountain Association, AMA. And one of the first things they did was to rebuild a stone hut. So the stone hut was originally built in 1858. And it amazes me how they built that, because you can see from the old stones, they're all cut out. They had to drill the holes and drive wedges in. And I'm sure all those holes were drilled by hand because they didn't have any steam drills at the top of the mountain at that time. So the AMA was, according to the records, was formed in 1903, and that was one of the first things they did, and rebuilt the hut and put the roof on so people could stay in it. In 1904, they also started having a picnic hike on the Labor Day weekend every year. So I think 1904 was maybe the second one, and they made a big thing out of it, and they had 700 people on the top of the mountain, and we've got pictures of that. There's some very good pictures The whole top was covered with people.
And
There-
didn't they have the marching Windsor military band?
They brought the military band up. They had dignitaries make speeches, and the picture shows, imagine 700 people walking up to the top of that mountain with only two trails, the Windsor Trail and the Brownsville Trail. So it must have been a steady stream. And the women in the picture all got their long dresses on, the big fluffy hats, men suits, vests, and dressed up almost in their Sunday best. So that must have been quite an event.
You know, amazes me, Don, too, is that you would see horse and buggies somehow got up that trail.
A couple of
And
times.
that started at the base at Dudley Farm. I
Right.
guess it was called the Dudley Farm.
Right.
And they probably were following an old logging road quite a bit of the way, but it amazes me how they made that final.
A pretty
Please
rough
to the
ride,
top.
but also in Edith Hunter's history, she says she'd heard that an automobile with a chain drive got up there. It might have been some kind of a truck, but that's all. It was in her history.
How in the world could that happen? That's amazing.
So yeah, the AMA they'd have these picnics every year, and usually they'd get 500 or 600 people. People did a lot more. Well, there weren't so many other things to do. I guess people like to do a lot more hiking at that
I
time.
hope they brought their own lunches.
And the interesting thing is, in this 1904, there was a group that wanted to have a car railroad built up Mount Ascutney, like the one on Mount Washington, because the Mount Washington one was so successful. And they thought they would, because people could come in to Windsor by train, and they also thought of running the electric railroad from Charlestown up to here. And I think it's a great thing that never went through.
Yeah. I think I'm happy it didn't,
Right.
too.
Did you know where they would have had the cog railway?
I don't, except they'd probably pick the best route. I'm sure it was on the east side, probably about where the Windsor Trail goes now. And who knows where they would have built it. But
That's interesting.
I didn't start hiking. You people started way back when you were teenagers. I think the first time I hiked Mount Ascutney was, I think, would be 1966 or 67. I was over at the foot of the mountain, well, actually the foot of the Wethersfield Trail, with a friend of mine. He was showing me a house lot he just bought there. Well, while we were there, these two guys came walking down the mountain, and they said they were surveying a trail. And I guess that was Herb Ogden and his son. So we got kind of interested in it. So after they left, they said they'd made a few markers up the trail. He and I walked up, and I think I had a teenage daughter that went with us. The old Wethersfield Trail, of course, went up to the parking lot, where the parking lot is now. But we got way up in that area, and we saw these red blazes on trees, so we thought, well, that must be where the trail is. Actually, it was the boundary of the state land, and it was pretty rough going up over there. And it was in, I guess, in May, and there was about that much snow on the ground. We got up into the rough tangle where trees are down and everything, and there were some bear tracks. And I know my daughter got kind of scared, but we didn't see the bear.
So when did you get involved with the Ascutney Trails Association?
Well, I didn't go on the first hike. I think maybe about 1970. I think I hiked again in 1970, and then a couple of years after that, I got involved and began to work on the picnics. I don't know exactly when I started on the picnics, but it's been quite a while.
Did you work on the shelter any?
I didn't, no. Paul Magoon did, we've got some good pictures of when they did build the shelter. And that was built in 78. 68, I'm sorry. Yeah, about a year after they formed the ATA.
What was the does anybody know what the Windsor Trail was like when Herb started thinking he wanted to reopen the Windsor Trail? Was it had been in disrepair, hadn't it?
Yeah, I think we got some pictures somewhere in the book that shows how rough it was and all kinds of blowdown. They had to cut a lot of stuff out.
Well, did the 1903 trail still exist at that time?
Well, I'm not sure, because there seems to be a little difference of opinion. The original trail that they were going to make for Lafayette, I assume, might have followed somewhat where the Windsor Trail is now. And they did some work on it way back then, but then Lafayette, I guess, didn't even come to Windsor, did he?
Yes, he did come to Windsor,
okay,
but he was unable to make the trip up the mountain.
Yeah, the schedule was such he couldn't make it.
I didn't mean that. I meant when Herb Ogden started, was the 1903 trail still usable? Because he started the 1857 trail, right? That's the one he cut,
see.
Right?
Yeah.
I
really can't answer that.
Yeah, maybe we should just stop right here. And when you get to Halfway Spring and the Chase and Carpenter log cabin, the trail goes to the right to the log shelter. Now, which trail is that?
That's the 1857 one, and I think that's the one that Herb Ogden reopened, because he opened that up so it could get to the shelter, because that's the side where the big fire ruined the trail earlier.
Yeah.
Okay, then if you go to the left, it takes you up to where you can connect to the 1903 trail or go on to Blood Rock. Does anybody want to tell a story about how Blood Rock got its name?
I can tell you what I heard, but I'm not sure it's true. But the story I heard was that somewhere around 1927, there was a landslide which exposed this rock, which we used to call Windsor Rock when I was a kid.
Because you can see it from the town of Windsor. It's exposed.
But I understand that Houghton Hoisington was in the group of men, young people at that time, to investigate it. And while they were checking it out, he got a cut. And so he bled, so they called it Blood Rock.
Oh, well, I like that story.
That's the story I heard. Is that right?
How about you, Ralph?
I haven't, that's when I wasn't around. And that part of it, but when I was going up there frequently as a kid, there was 2 trails from the Halfway Springs.
There was 2 trails.
Yes, there's 2. One went up one way, but they ended up together when you got to the top.
Yeah. They came together. They come together. I don't know how to describe that, but there's the Blood Rock and the 1903 and then the 1857, and then they come together at a junction. Yeah. Maybe what? Quarter of a mile? I don't know how much.
Well, the 03 and the 1857 come together first. Mm-hmm. And then further up, the Blood Trail joins the Windsor Trail.
But you still have a ways to go to the summit.
Yes.
Yes, I think about a half a mile.
Yeah, probably about a half a mile from there.
Well, I could tell you one interesting thing about the tower. This would be later. This would probably when I was a senior in high school around 1939. No. And I think it was Dan Hall and Kermit Pratt and I went up the Windsor Trail, and at that time the metal tower was pretty new, and it had a glass encased top. It was really nice with a little trap door to enter. And we went up there, and we were able to lay 3 sleeping bags down. There's just room, so we slept there one night. And the wind would blow and the tower would sway, you know. We thought that was great.
Oh, that's wonderful. The other night when we had our Ascutney Trails meeting, Rick White from Forest Parks and Recreation did a little program on the CCC camp, and I understand it was those men built that later fire tower. Is that correct?
1937.
Right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It was through the CCC camps.
Yeah, that's what sparked my interest in what was the story about the wooden tower, because I knew nothing about it, and I wondered what was there when they put in the metal tower?
Well, back when I was a kid and stayed up there with the ranger, it was a wooden tower south of the stone hut, and there was just a ladder up, and you just climbed the ladder until you got there.
Oh, this wasn't on the summit?
Hmm?
The wooden tower was not on the summit?
It was just a little ways south of the stone cabin.
Oh, that's not on the summit, is it?
Probably not, but they probably could still see because there
Oh,
weren't
yes.
many trees.
They get up above it.
That was a bear.
That was bare up there then.
One story that was prevalent back in them days, that there was either 3 or 4 men in Windsor that each owned their own individual lot. At one time they sold lots up there, and 4 men bought them, and eventually the state bought them and became owners of all the top. Now they own the top, but at one time they did not own the complete top of the
I heard
mountain.
a little about that. I'm not really up on it, but I did hear that same thing. There were certain people that owned parts of that. I think now that the state owns
Yes.
most of it.
Yeah,
West
the whole
Windsor
top.
goes up. West Windsor's property goes up to a peak up there
Yes.
near the West Peak.
Yes,
But,
I believe they do.
right. And we have 3 trailheads, the Wethersfield, Brownsville, and Windsor, and they are all now the property of the state, so that those trailheads are preserved. I guess we should back up a little and talk about the Ascutney Trails Association was founded, and the first meetings were in like 1966, and in 1967 they had their first annual picnic to go up the mountain, which would make it 40 years. I have a t-shirt from 30, whoops, can't see it, from the 30th. We had other t-shirts for the 20th. We have a patch, I don't know if you can see that we sell up there on the top. We also
that one?
have,
What is that?
that was it's just an Ascutney Trails.
Oh, it's not a
shirt.
Okay.
No date.
Okay.
We also had a hat for the 2000 millennium. I can never say that.
Millennium.
See who can say that. We also have these hiking cups, and we have a hiking cup for the youngest hiker who hikes all the way from the top. I mean, from the bottom to the top, and also one for the oldest hiker. And mostly the youngest hikers are maybe 4 years old, and the oldest hikers could be in their 70s or their 80s.
I think the oldest one was either 86 or 87.
Right, that
And,
was
The guy from
Taplin.
Theo Taplin,
Yeah, Taplin.
and the other fellow from up in that same area. I was trying to think of his name. Yeah,
They used to
Joe.
compete. Joe Tuttle.
Joe Tuttle. Yeah.
Right.
See, Joe was the father of the famous man with a plan.
Oh.
Joe was his father.
Oh.
So
he was-
these picnics that we have, and we still continue to have them, are always held around Memorial Day, and the directors of the association ride up the mountain road, and from there we take the food, sandwiches, cookies, apples, and a lot of water for drink. And then we welcome all the hikers who may come up the Wethersfield Trail, the Windsor Trail, the Brownsville Trail, and have them sign in and give them lunch. And usually, I guess when this first started, now I don't know because I wasn't on those first few hikes, but there were close to 200 people that came up on those days. And now we usually have maybe 100, 125. And we have a wonderful day. Anybody have any memories of those hikes?
Some of those.
Yes, going back, the first two meetings we had at Herb Ogden's. But that was in the north. He was the northern person on the group that was forming it. And we had one from Springfield, so they decided to have the meeting. We had one meeting at, I believe, in Windsor at Urquhart's house, but all of the rest of them was at my house. My wife was very much interested in it and took part in it, and while she wasn't a director, she had her name, she had her voice in it, as you know.
Right.
And we, one thing I will say, and everybody likes, she always had good refreshments for us.
Well, that's important.
That's very important. And Dean Milligan was where they had the other house, other meeting, I mean, in Windsor. But it was much easier for people from both ends to meet in Windsor than it would for everybody to drive to Heartland or to Springfield. And
well, those are the meetings. Those were the meetings when you were forming the organization.
Yes, and writing the first book, guide, and then the first picnic plans were made right then at breakfast nook
overlooking the pond.
And first wife and I very much participated in the first two picnics up there.
You were mentioning the book. This is one of our guidebooks, and the first one was printed by Herb Ogden.
Yes.
At his own printing press, and this actually was the 1992, but we've had a 6th edition. I think it was done in 1998. But we still have copies of the first one, and it's a wonderful book because it had all of Herb's special little filigree and printing.
Yeah, he liked to do that.
Don probably can tell us a little bit about that. I don't know.
Well, I've tried to I make the souvenir cards now, and I've tried to duplicate a little bit of the filigree that he put around the edge. Of course, I do it on my computer. Yeah, Barbara, the first early picnics, and I think some of the first ones that I worked on, they would get 350 people.
Standard.
And there was one, I think either the second or third year, they claimed they had a little over 400 signed the book.
Yeah, I think that's in the records. I remember working one of the early picnics I worked on, because we always bring up a lot of water, and we have water for people. And it turned out it was a hot day, and I think we used up 40 gallons of water, and we ran out. See, at that time, we didn't tell people on our posters or in our notices in the paper to be sure to bring a canteen of water. So a lot of people, when they got up to the top on that hot day, they were panting, and they'd come over and drink 3 or 4 cups of water, just like that. Now they do a little bit better.
And when you started, they used to close the road, didn't they?
Right, yeah.
Now
People
they
didn't
let
come up the
people
road.
come up the road to our picnic.
Later, yeah.
Yeah.
We didn't used to serve anybody that we thought walked in from the road, but now we're a little gentler, and we give them a water and a sandwich if we have some left over.
We used to take up, I remember Mrs. Dan Parker's husband, Dan, was an elderly man, and he wanted to go hike up. He and, I don't know, some other person was going to hike up, and she didn't think he should. And of course, she had known me all my life, and I was the director of it, and called me down to their house, and when he wasn't there, and we talked it over how I could get him to go up and not walk. So I figured it out, and I got talking with him, and I said, Dan, I said, could we get you to help carry up the lunch? Well, if there's anything I can do, I sure will help you. And I said, okay, then here you go. And he rode up to the parking lot with me, and I had a lot of stuff in there. But among them, I had 2 gallon, well, I might have had more than that. I had 2-gallon jugs of coffee. And I asked Dan to carry them. And he had one in each hand. He said, that balance is fine. It's easy walking that way. And he was really happy that he helped carry the lunch up to the top. And that way, she didn't have to worry about his climbing from the bottom up. But old Dan Parker was a marvelous old gentleman.
Yeah, I met him, and I knew 2 of his sons real well because I worked in the same place.
Yeah, Marty and Dan.
Dan, yeah.
I hadn't seen Dan for many years until I was with my brother, and we saw him in the store there. But I hunt with Marty, or used to, out to their camp.
Camp up in
I went out there with Dan and Marty and Kendall when I was probably around 12, 13 years old.
Right.
Those are great memories we have of the Windsor Trail.
He had a couple of brothers and 2 or 3 sisters, so the kids all walked up, but the adults rode the burros. And I understand from reading history that once you got to the top, they'd let the burros go and they'd go back down to the bottom. But the older people could walk back. And I'm not sure whether that happened when my father went up there or not. But
when was that? The late 1800s?
Yeah, it was a kid. He was born in 1881, so that would be sometime in the late 1880s or early 1890s when he was 8 or 10 years old. And I thought that was...
They go to the base
right.
where the Dudley farm.
I think it was...
A few notes here, so we're going to...
Evidently, we've just looked at the records, and at the Dudley farm where they rented these burros, the burros had names. And one of them was Wilson, one was Taft, and one was Roosevelt. So they named them after presidents.
Well, I think that's great. We should do that now. I remember one year we were up at the annual picnic, and an alpaca or a llama came in.
Yeah.
I think it belonged to the Clattenburgs.
Right.
It came up to the top. What were you going to say?
I was going to speak
about the
poem.
Poem of the Falls.
Well, what was it about Jerry Falls or Gary Falls? This is what, 8/10 of a mile up the mountain at the beginning of the Windsor Trail?
I was just, there's this metal plaque on the rock, and they got this poem printed on it. And I always thought that Gary wrote this, but then I thought I heard from Steve later when he investigated that poem was written in memory of him because he was an outdoor man, but I don't know. But anyway, the way the poem goes is sort of like this. The truth at the heart of nature, the light that is not of day, why seek it afar forever when it cannot be lifted away?
That's a wonderful.
And so there are many ways of interpreting it. The second line, if you happen to have a religious bent, you could say, the light that is not of day, you'd say, well, this might be Jesus, but then it doesn't fit with the rest of it. So there seems to be a combination of maybe a little religion and a little of the love of nature. And frankly, I've never been able to take all 4 verses there, all 4 lines, and make one story that seems to fit. Can anyone else interpret it?
I certainly can't, but I've never, given it that much thought, Proctor. I think that's great.
It's sort of like the spirit of nature is here, and it's everywhere. So why go somewhere else seeking it when it's here?
Well, I think that's a great interpretation. Would be.
I've seen the plaque, but I haven't been up the mountain for. I can get up there fine, but I can't come down.
Can't come down.
Only roll.
Well, as I remember, Gary was a hunter, but also a great lover of nature. And he was killed. He shot himself. He was hunting. he put his rifle down somehow, and he went to climb a wall, and somehow he hit the trigger, and he shot himself, and he was only a young man.
Gerry Falls, or Gary Falls, whichever way you pronounce it, is Gerry, correct? That's about how far up on the Windsor Trail? It's the first...
You said 8/10.
8/10 of a mile, right? And there's a beautiful waterfall there.
Yeah.
Great place always to get some water, or should we say that? Although many people don't want to drink the water from
We
that
used to
mountain.
drink it back then. We didn't worry about such matters. It was water.
It was wet,
Nowadays
we drank
we worry
it.
about it.
Right.
The nice thing about Gary's Falls is they have that plaque there, and the plaque has been there ever since they put it in. And years ago, when we put the plaque up on Gus's lookout for him, 2 or 3 years later, somebody ripped it out. Somehow they pried it out because it was well anchored in the rock, and it disappeared. So now we've put up a new one, and we hope that one is never.
That's for
Handling.
Gusty Aldrich.
Gussie
Yes.
at Gus's lookout. Yeah.
Did you know him?
Yes. And
Marvelous man.
yeah, he was a sort of, some people called him sort of a Renaissance man, because he was a great hiker. He had a lot of, he knew a lot about surveying and where to find things and rocks and the whole bit.
He was a graduate of UVM.
Right.
Don't we have a picture of him somewhere up on top of a tree?
Yep.
And he always hiked with a long kind
There's
of...
quite a few pictures. And then the famous one is the one that the artist in Springfield, a fellow that used to teach art at Springfield High School, drew a painting.
I guess I've never seen that.
We've got copies of it, yeah. Gus was quite a character. And I remember one time when I had a scout troop back in about the early 60s, we cleared a little, the troop had a project, we cleared a little bit of the Crown Point Road, and Gus showed us up near his farm where it went. So one day I went up alone, and he was going to show me another part of the trail where the road where we could work on it with the scouts. I remember it was a hot day in June, and got up there, picked up Gussie up at his house. He had these big barn boots, that farmers always wore, and we went down and walked a piece of the Crown Point Road, and I was sweating profusely, and Gus was marching along and could hardly keep him. And I had a little Cocker Spaniel dog that was going with us, and she was running along with her tongue hanging out. And
that's great.
but he was a great hiker, and every time he hiked a mountain, he'd stand on his head and have his picture taken. I've seen a picture of him on top of Mount Marcy with his legs up like that, and his pants would of course go back down his leg a ways, and his little bandy white ankles sticking out.
He's a
Didn't
wonderful
he also
person.
used to climb trees and get ahead of you, and when you'd come along, he'd throw things down at you?
That's it. That's Gussie.
One time we were hiking on the Crown Point Road up in the Cavendish area, and there was quite a group of us, and we went up to this old cemetery, and we were looking at all the stones and stuff. And finally one of the ladies said, "Where's Gussie?" And we looked all around and couldn't see him. There was a great big tree that was down. It was leaning almost over our head. We looked up, and there he is. He'd walked up that tree. And I was up at Mount Katahdin 2 years after he disappeared up there. And I met the ranger that Gus and his friend had driven up to Katahdin, and they hiked into what was called Chimney Pond. And on the way up to Chimney Pond, Gussie said, "Well, I don't feel too good." And he told his partner, "You go ahead, and I'll come along later." Well, when this partner was a lady from Rutland, when she got up to Chimney Pond, she immediately went to the ranger there, and she said, "There's this elderly man," because he was 86 then, "back down on the trail. He's not feeling well." So the ranger went down and found Gus, And the ranger took his pack, and the two of them walked up to Chimney Pond, and he and his friend were staying in they had these shelters there. Next morning when they woke up and got up, Gussie was gone. And that's the last anybody ever saw of him. And this ranger was kind of, when I was up there, it was 2 years later, they had found a bone way out there somewhere, and they thought maybe it's one of his. And they were going to send it to a laboratory to have it analyzed to see whether it was an animal or a person. They couldn't tell from looking at it, and it might be a bear. And so I told the man, the ranger, I said, if you ever find out that it was a person, let me know, and I gave him my address. But I never heard from him, so I guess it didn't turn out to be.
Maybe just as well, right?
Yeah.
Hey, we were just talking about the Jerry Falls. Then as you keep going up the Windsor Trail, you come to Halfway Spring, and then you go to the log shelter. And do you know anything about the building of the log shelter? Was it 1967 or 8?
The log shelter was built in 68, and of course it was headed up by Herb Ogden and his son. And I knew at least one person who worked on it with him, and that was Paul Magoon. What they did, of course that's below the parking lot, but they trucked the stuff up to the parking lot and then carried it down to where the log shelter is now, was built. I had records at one time on the number of pounds of cement powder they had to take, bags of cement, because if you look at that fireplace, that's a huge fireplace, and it took a lot of cement to make the mortar to hold all the stones together. And then they brought the roofing down. In fact, we have a picture in the book with Paul Magoon in it. They had kind of a little wheel thing that they could put sheets of corrugated roofing on and wheel it down. Most of the timber, of course, was cut locally right around the area, because there were a lot of good small spruce trees. So that's where they got the logs to build the rest of the shelter. And of course they were lucky. There was a spring there that's good most of the year, that runs out of the rocks. And sometimes there's too much water coming in out of the rocks, and that's why Crofter and others put in the floor last year, because the shelter used to get real wet and soggy on the floor.
Ralph, do you remember any discussion of that at some of your meetings?
No, that's after my day. That shelter wasn't there.
For quite a while, after I started working with the ATA, we had snowshoe hikes every winter. We'd go up to the shelter, and we'd get boil up a big pot of soup and some hot coffee and hot cocoa, mostly cocoa, I guess. And it was to get the kids interested in snowshoe hiking. So we'd snowshoe up to the shelter, and we'd have a raffle, or it really wasn't a raffle. We'd give them tickets, and the lucky ticket would win a pair of snowshoes. And we'd have usually 3 snowshoe hikes every winter.
I remember those, because Crofter and I got into those maybe the last 5 years. And then we had 3, or they had 3, and then we kind of put it down to 2, and then we had 1. We even changed the place for it. It was a little bit closer, but we just didn't get the participants, but it was fun. And I remember my son and his friends, probably when they were 10 or 11, participated in that, and we were still giving out the snowshoes.
Some of the last year or two that I worked on the snowshoe hike, we had some terrible weather. We had big rainstorms, so it was pretty icy in one spot, where you go along beside that gully, and you kind of had to watch out that you didn't slide down into it. And so the hike sort of died out after that.
Well, on one occasion, Barbara and I deliberately slid down into the brook.
Right.
We had our new Sherpas.
Oh yeah, because you
We
had
still
your
couldn't
claws.
hold ourselves
Yeah.
on the ice coming down, so we finally sat down and slid down into the brook, right? Then we followed the brook down.
Then we called the radio station and canceled the snowshoe hike because we thought we didn't want anybody attempting it.
Yeah.
That sounds like
scary.
something you two would do. One year, snowmobiles used to try to climb up there, and one year, a snowmobile went down into that gully, and we could see from the tracks that they must have had quite a time getting it out. They evidently got some guys up there with ropes and pulled it up out of there. At one time, I remember seeing snowmobile tracks that went all the way to the log shelter. We had quite a lot of snow that year, and so there was a good cover. But it must have been a pretty rough trip up near the top.
I won't encourage that, will we? So I guess we all know, really care about Mount Ascutney, and we hope that our stories have been entertaining, and maybe we'll continue, tell more tales about more trails on Mount Ascutney.